Hi everyone, I'm Associate Professor Sarah Bice, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our very first pre-recorded lecture for Globalization and Governance in this special online course. So join me today as I'm in my bright and sunny kitchen in Melbourne, Australia, where the weather is beautiful and the coffee is hot, and hopefully we're ready to learn. In this pre-recorded lecture, we're going to look through a number of things together. We're going to think about the big questions that shape this course and the work that we're going to do over the next semester. What are the main issues that we're going to explore together? What are the critical questions that we're going to try and tackle? And what are the big public policy problems that we're going to explore together? So I really want to, in the next 20 to 25 minutes, expose you to the broad ideas or concepts underpinning this course. We're also going to ask you in your discussion activities, so the thing that you'll do for a response after this lecture, to think about what public policy means to you. We often use that term a lot. So how do we define and understand public policy? And we're going to think in particular about some arguments around globalization. So is the world a place that's becoming closer and more homogenized, or is it a place that's growing further apart and we're seeing an increase in heterogeneity? These are really important questions when we consider globalization and governance. The things that will get you to watch today as part of your lecture pre-record are obviously this PowerPoint, and it looks like you're here now, so welcome, good job. Also remember that because we have this online course opportunity, you can always pause this video, you can go back, you can take whatever time you need. If something really sparks your imagination or you're unsure of something, pause the video, use your web browser, look things up, go back to your readings. There's really an opportunity here to use this type of learning to make it work for you. And I'm here to help you as much as possible. The other thing that we're going to ask you to watch in preparation for our discussion from today's lecture is a video of Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore for many years served as the Dean of the National University of Singapore School of Public Policy, and he was also previously an ambassador to the United Nations for Singapore. His work is in our readings for this week, and it's something that'll hopefully spark conversation around what it means to say that we have a globalized world or globalized public policy. The other thing it would be great for you to watch to support our live online discussion forum this week is your course structure and assessment guide, and that will be available shortly through our online course website. Okay, so let's start thinking. And if you're already overwhelmed, you can just press pause. Seriously, hopefully you're still with us. Let's start thinking. What are the key concepts and ideas that underpin this course? For your first discussion forum, when we meet live online in Zoom, one of the things I would love for you to have thought about and to come prepared to talk about is this big idea of Asia. What is it that we mean when we say Asia? And is this the Asian century? Slides, you will find that there is a little map that you can download. It's a coloring in sheet, and it's probably from a children's schooling website, but nevertheless, it's a helpful heuristic because what I would love for you to do before we speak is to look at that global map, to get yourself a shading pencil or a texta or a highlighter, and I want you to think about what areas or countries on that map would you include as being part of Asia. And I'd like you not just to try and color in your map, but I'd like you to think, what characteristics are you using to define Asia? What criteria tell you that a country or a region are in Asia? And what characteristics tell you that a country or a region is not part of Asia? We'd really like to be able to discuss those together in our live online forum. So have a think about that. And again, if you want to do the activity right now, pause the video, click on the link, and go for your life. If you're going to stick with us, why are we talking about Asia? Well, in a course on globalization and governance, Asia as a region, however you define it, contains an estimated 60% of the global population right now in the regions that we might say are bounded by Mongolia in the north, Indonesia in the south, Korea in the east, and Afghanistan in the west. So we've got a really, really large region, and it's a growing. Right now, there are more people living inside this little highlighted bubble than outside of it. Approximately 60% of the world's population lives in what was just defined as the Asian region. It's really important. So if Asia is such a big region, if it's so powerful, and we're talking about globalization and governance, the question then becomes, well, why this course and why now? This is my third year teaching this particular course at SPPM. And one of the reasons I love it is because it's really current and it's really timely. And it gets us thinking about how globalization and the way in which geopolitical structures and cultures are shifting are impacting how we understand public policy and how international governance is performed. And indeed, right now, we are all in different places because the world is facing a geopolitical or geo-health governance crisis. So a question within this and within thinking about globalization, something that I'm very curious about is this idea of, is this the Asian century? Are we, when we talk about globalization today, experiencing a genuine and fundamental geopolitical and cultural shift towards the Asian region that will affect how we understand and perform governance? Why might this be the Asian century? There are a lot of arguments for it, and there are also arguments against. But we're seeing today a lot of economic arguments, notions of market imperatives, and the ideas of joined up or integrated financial markets, particularly increasingly from the Asian region. As an example, Indonesia's stock exchange has more than doubled in the 12 years since 2008, and it now stands as the largest stock exchange in Southeast Asia. We see international intergovernmental groups like ASEAN continuing to gain in influence, and certainly that's the case as we see groups like the European Union struggle through situations like the recent Brexit. We're also seeing developing countries in the region, particularly Myanmar, opening up new resources and industries. This is also happening throughout Central Asia and many of the stands where they have very resource-intense industries and resource-intense industry potential. By 2025, India will become the world's fifth largest consumer market, and it is predicted to be home to 3/4 of the world's middle class. By 2050, China is slated to dominate the world economy. So really, when we talk about globalization in this course, one of the things that we're thinking about together is how are these economies and cultures shifting into a position different to that of the past, or a reemergence of one of that past, where Asia is becoming a more dominant region within the global sphere. And just to give you a very simple graphic to represent that, this comes from the McKinsey Global Institute estimates of what size markets countries are likely to have by 2050 relative to other major countries around the globe. By 2050, you can see represented by size here that China's economic market is predicted to become the largest globally, with the US trailing relatively closely behind, followed by India and then Japan. Obviously, right now we're in a bit of a state of unknown, and we don't know what the local, in terms of China, or global implications of the current health crisis may be on the economy. But these figures to 2050 have been around for some time, and unless there is some major global shift, we would expect this to hold. So often as well, we talk about terms like globalization. And I mentioned before, I would love for you to think about, what do you mean by public policy? What do you mean when we say words like governance? One of the things I really want us to do together in this course is to question taken for granted concepts like these. And a critical, often taken for granted concept is globalization. So what do we mean when we say globalization? What are we experiencing? Some of the literature gives us a few ideas, and I'd really encourage you to have a read through the readings and have a think for yourself. What is it that makes you think globalization is occurring? The literature often focuses on what we're experiencing right now, which is this time-space compression. So the capacity that we have now to communicate across time and space in a way that wasn't historically possible. And that's based largely on advances in science and technology, as well as our capacity to access information and knowledge. So indeed, if anything that I'm talking about is a little confusing to you, or you're simply very curious and you want to find out more, you could seriously pause this video right now, go onto your web browser, and find access to more information, scholarly articles, newspaper materials, videos, Instagrams, tweets, whatever, than ever possible before in the history of the world. So access to knowledge and information is also playing a huge part in what we consider to be the process of globalization. And ultimately, these things taken together are leading to what Manuel Castells, who's a very famous sociologist, has called the network society. So instead of living in kind of disparate, isolated areas, Castell argues that we are now all part of this big web of societies and politics and relations. And so this network society creates this sense of globalization where the local and the global come together. And certainly that's happening with us in this classroom. The other reason that we look at globalization and governance together in one course is because we're very curious about wicked problems. Now, I want to warn you here because a lot of people love to say, oh, I've got a wicked policy problem. It's really difficult. Well, I'm sure that some of the policy problems that you and your colleagues have looked at, because many of you are working or have recently been working in public service, I'm sure many of those problems were difficult, but let's question if they were really wicked according to the definition in the literature. So Riddle and Weber came up with the idea, and I'm sorry here you can't quite see it on the slide because it's gone behind my video, but that little R there is the beginning of Riddle's name. So Riddle and Weber, way back in 1973, wrote a very unsexily titled article, Dilemmas for the General Theory of Planning. And that was the first time that any public policy scholars articulated an idea of a wicked problem. And in that they said wicked problems are very specific and very special problems. They are ones that lack definitive solutions. They're ones that occur in very gray areas, places where we don't have a black or white answer. Wicked problems are really complex, but also importantly, each wicked problem is unique and each wicked problem presents a new challenge. And in presenting a new challenge, one of the things that makes these problems wicked is that there is simply no easy way or no previously known way to test policy solutions. So I've also noted there Brian Head's article from 2008, and that appears in the recommended readings for this week on the course website. And just a note, each week you will have required readings. Those are the ones we expect you to do at a minimum. And you'll also have some recommended readings, like this one, for those of you who are interested in a particular topic or issue and you want to go into more detail. Okay, excuse me while I have some coffee and you can think about wicked problems. The other thing we want to think about together in this class is this notion of global problems. So why are public policy problems changing? One of the things that we are seeing is that public policy traditionally and historically takes place at a very domestic or localized level. But in this course, we're going to look together at global problems. So we're going to look at problems that have to do with the global environment, like climate change. As I'm sitting in Australia, many of my friends and colleagues have recently been struggling with the largest bushfires ever to date. So this is an issue. Right, okay, so like many of you, I am having to work from home, and in this case, that means my kids are around. So from time to time, you may see them, and maybe if I get really tired of recording lectures, we can get them to guest star. So anyhow, my daughter now has a piece of toast, and we can go on. So global problems. Together, what we want to look at are global problems to do with issues like the environment. And I was just mentioning that here in Australia, that's become a major issue over our current summer with bushfires and climate change. We're looking at the interrelated or intersectionality of market economies, and that's certainly something that's happening at the moment with unknowns around how economies are going to be affected by the current health crisis. And the other thing that we're going to look at together is something called hypernorms. So hypernorms are this notion that there are a set of principles or morals or values that all of us share just by dint of being human beings. So it doesn't matter what country you come from, it doesn't matter what religion you follow, it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are or what other beliefs that you hold. The notion of hypernorms is that we have some shared foundational values or principles that exist simply because we are human beings. One really good example of hypernorms is the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Now, even that is controversial, and indeed there's an entire literature about what those scholars call Asian human rights. And so hypernorms are this kind of very important theoretical idea. Are there things that we all can agree upon? For instance, that we should protect our planet, our home, that exists simply because we are human beings. And so that's something that we will also think about together throughout this course. And if you're interested in hypernorms, that's another area where we have provided some recommended readings. There's some really interesting work, for instance, from Donna Woods. One of the things that we're going to consider together in this course as well in taking the topic of globalization and governance is to really unpack and critically think about how do we understand processes of governance? How do we understand what governance means? How do we understand what public policy is and should do? And one of the ways that I'm going to encourage you to think about this is to really question the norm and question the usual policy science. So a colleague, Angela Merriam, and I, a couple of years ago, we undertook a major study where we wanted to see how much non-Western public policy scholarship is out there and getting published in mainstream journals. And so we looked at public policy journals, the major ones, defined as those that have an impact factor greater of 1. So all that means, you don't need to really understand impact factors. All that means is that these journals are the ones that everyone reads, and they're the ones that every scholar wants to be published in. So we looked at 5 leading mainstream public policy journals. So these are English language journals. And we wanted to see what was being published in those journals that would be representative of the Asian region, or what we might consider to be globalized public policy scholarship. And perhaps unsurprisingly, but certainly disappointingly, we found only 52 articles out of about 2,300 articles referred to non-Western public policy scholarship. The reason I'm telling you this now is because as we work together through the semester and we think about how we understand globalization and governance, we have to keep in the back of our minds that much of the public policy scholarship to which we are exposed comes from the West. It comes from certain people with certain perspectives. And often those perspectives are white, Anglo-Saxon, and male. So just keep that in mind. One of the things that my colleague Helen Sullivan, who is the director of the Crawford School of Public Policy, where I work full-time at the Australian National University, she and I have talked for a long time about how can we push public policy scholarship to be more globalized, to move away from that one group of common scholars that I noted before, to be much more inclusive and indeed, I think, a lot more interesting. So what we talk about together is this notion of globalized public policy scholarship, where public administration is context specific. You can't just take a public administration out of its local culture. Like, you do have to consider these things. But at the same time, it is more globally relevant through understanding local culture. And we're also very interested in how can we understand what it means to be and to do Asian public administration. So really today's lecture is just giving you a bit of a flavor of the big questions that we'll explore together in the course and some of the background thinking behind the big ideas that we're going to work on together. And this is one of those big ideas. How can we understand public policy, administration, and governance from new and more unusual and different angles, particularly globalized ones, and particularly ones that take more of a non-Western lens. So one of the articles assigned for you today builds on work that Helen and I did back in 2014, where we really encouraged in an article that we wrote in Governance, public policy scholars and students to start to question what are the constructs underpinning contemporary public policy and governance. And by that we just mean let's question the definitions and let's really think about what do we mean by these terms that we use all the time. We also think it's really important to explore the content of contemporary public policy. So what does it mean to be a policy administrator today? What types of issues and tasks do you need to take on? What types of roles do you need to perform? And that leads to our final point. It's really important today when we consider globalization and governance to think about what does it look like to actually do public policy in a globalized environment? What does it mean to conduct public policy in a globalized environment? Whew. This is very strange for me because I am a very interactive lecturer and I'm really used to having you guys in the room and we would all talk to each other and we'd write lots of stuff on the board and we'd be doing all kinds of questions and I do heaps of group activities. And if you ask any of my former students who've taken this class, they would be like, wow, yeah, we did a lot of activities. So I feel like I'm talking at you a lot. Just bear with me and remember you can always press pause and get a coffee and come back. Okay, if you're still with me, let's keep going. So one of the things and a huge question that we want to explore together in this class is what does globalization today look like? And there are really two kind of poles of globalization. One is this notion of convergence, and that is what is it that because of globalization, because of this space-time compression, because of network society, what is bringing us together? And the other aspect is divergence. So because we're all more mobile, because we all have more access to each other, because more threats globally are opening up, is this causing us to grow apart? Is globalization actually leading to more divergence? So these are some of the things that Mahbubani talks about in his article that we've assigned for today. And I'd really encourage you to think about what you think about globalization. What's bringing us together or causing us to converge? And what's pulling us apart or causing us to diverge from one another? Another article that you have for this week is from the Brookings Institute, and it questions globalization, and it says, are we really on a trend to globalization? Some countries and markets have argued recently that actually globalization is in decline, but when we look at the figures like those shown here, that is patently not true. So what we saw, and you can see in the middle of the graph here, around 1950, which was the end of World War II and the formation of the United Nations, there was a huge retreat to the fortress, as Mahbubani calls it. So countries said, we want to become really nationalist, we want to become very isolationist, and there was very much a reduction in globalization. But ever since World War II and the kind of international healing that's happened since then, we have seen an increase in globalization, and that is largely due to increased global mobility and many of the factors that we noted before, which lead to globalization. So even where we see increased populism, like the nationalist Trump administration in the United States, where we see movements like Brexit and the separation of Britain from the broader European Union, even where we see the rise of right-wing politics throughout parts of Europe, globalization itself as a trend has not gone into reverse. Indeed, globalization is still a really, really important part of contemporary society. What has changed, however, and we can see this in this graph here, since the early 2000s, we have seen an increase in negative media sentiment about globalization. So globalization today gets more negative, and you can see this by the downward sloping graph there. It gets more negative media coverage than in the past. So globalization as a process is by no means in decline, but public perceptions of globalization, at least as seen here by this study in the United States and in the UK, is much more negative. People see globalization generally as a bad thing. And I'd really be interested to hear from you in our live discussions whether or not you think globalization is a bad thing, and also whether media coverage that relates to globalization in your own countries is positive or negative. So this is a great little graph from one of our articles from this week from the Harvard Business Review, where they talk about globaloney. So my grandmother, you guys may or may not get this cliche, but my grandmother, who grew up in the 1920s, and if something was just totally silly and she didn't believe it, she would say to us, "That's baloney." So that is why this is called globaloney, because it is baloney. So the idea here is that citizens were surveyed and asked what percentage of these things shown in the graph are impacted by globalization. So this is the kind of Donald Trump argument that, immigrants are taking all of our jobs because of globalization. When you look at the actual amount of exported goods and services in the United States, that's that lovely blue bar there. But when you ask survey respondents what they thought the actual amount of export goods and services were, it was much, much higher. And that was true for foreign direct investment flows and also for migrants. And so I think that one's particularly relevant to the current situation in the US. The point of this globaloney graph is that public perceptions of the impacts of globalization, including exports, FDI, and migration, far overestimate those impacts compared to the reality. And so this is one of the things that then leads to what we saw in the previous slide, that negative media sentiment, that negative notion that globalization is bad. People's perceived experience of globalization is far greater and far worse than what is actually happening. So, what does that all mean for public policy and public administration? Well, that is why, friends, we are here together to think about that for this whole semester. One of the things that I think will be really helpful for you, and we'll talk about this when we come together in Thursday's pre-recorded lecture, is Wolfgang Dreschler's 3 paradigms of public administration. So don't worry about this too much now, but I'd like you just to focus on that little bottom equation there that Wolfgang has come up with, and I've kindly written out in my own handwriting for him. He says, in most public policy scholarship, global equals Western public policy equals good. And so what we're going to do together is to question whether we agree with that particular equation, which Dreschler argues is the most common equation underpinning contemporary policy study. Hang in there, folks. We're at the 30-minute mark, and we're going to finish up here in about 5 minutes. So, what is this course about? It is about the macro. We are together going to look at the big pictures around globalization and governance, but we're also going to look at the micro. We're going to look at the people, the individuals, the public servants who roll out public policy and governance within this globalized environment. So whenever I ask you, what is this course about? It's about the macro, it's about, or the meta, it's about the meso, this kind of middle space, for instance, groups like the United Nations or ASEAN, and it's about the micro. So what public servants working in this globalized environment actually do. Each lecture, we're going to give you a couple of discussion questions or an activity to complete in writing. And for today's lecture, what I would like you to do is to consider these two questions, which I flagged earlier. So the first is, I would like to hear from you, and there is no right or wrong answer, and that's something I should be really clear about in this class. This class is about sparking critical thinking and curiosity and conversation. So no right or wrong answers, you just have to give things a go. The first discussion question is, how would you define public policy? And by that I mean, when you say public policy, what is it that you actually mean? What are you really talking about? I want you to dot point and unpack that taken for granted concept. The second discussion question for today's lecture is, what factors do you think are influencing convergence or divergence related to globalization? And again, you might just include a few dot points. So to recap for today's lecture, for our live discussion forum, which will take place either Monday night from 7 p.m. Beijing time, or depending on your current time zone, Tuesday morning from 4 a.m. Beijing time. For the live discussion, I'd like you to come prepared thinking about what countries you would include in Asia and what criteria you would apply to determine which countries are in or out of the Asian region. I'd also like you to be ready to just introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and why are you taking this class and what do you hope to get out of it? And I'd love to hear one random thing about you. So just something that maybe we wouldn't know if you didn't tell us. And then for your written discussion activities and responses, which are due for Monday lectures, they are always due by the end of your Wednesday in your time zone. I would like you to write a few dot points and respond to us. What do you mean by public policy? And what factors do you think are influencing global convergence or divergence? And you may say it's a bit of both, and that's fine, but I'd really like your ideas, okay? So dot points are fine. You don't have to write a big essay. So here's what we have to do after today's pre-recorded lecture. If you are not on our class WeChat group, make sure that you join up. You can find my own QR code for WeChat on a number of our documents and on our course website, so scan that. Let me know if you're not on our group. Please respond to our discussion questions. So prepare what you need to prepare that we will discuss verbally in our live online discussion forum. And also write your dot points, write your responses to those two questions that I just noted. And again, you can pause the video, you can go back, and you can also access these PowerPoint slides to review. Go ahead as well and do your reading and take notes for Thursday. So get ready for Thursday's lecture. And then next Monday, we will be talking about Thursday's lecture in our live discussion forum. Make sure that you're keeping up and checking out the course website for online materials. And by all means, get in touch with us if you have any questions or concerns whatsoever. Online teaching for this course is new to us as it is to you. And so we want to make it as terrific as possible. We're going to post shortly another video which will tell you all about the structure of this course and your assessment tasks. So please tune in to that next video and we'll let you know on the WeChat group when it's ready and available uploaded. So that's it from me for today. I really hope that you've enjoyed this first lecture, that you stuck with us, that you stayed awake, that you rewind if you need to, pause and take a break. We will see you online in our Zoom meeting room. And for this week, that meeting room number appears here. So just pop that in when you go into Zoom, click join meeting, put in this number, and we will see you online. So until then, good morning, good evening, or good night, wherever you are, we'll see you online.